You wake up the same way you did yesterday. Same notifications, same group chats, same people pulling at you from every direction before you've even had a single thought that belongs to you. You answer them. You always answer them. And somewhere in the middle of performing availability for everyone else's emergencies, you forget, again, that you had a mission. That is not a coincidence. That is the mechanism. Machiavelli called it something specific. He called it living under someone else's fortuna, not your own capacity for action, not your own strategic direction, but the constant turbulence of other people's needs, their noise, their emotional weather patterns flooding your attention like water through a cracked wall. And he wrote about this in 1513. Sitting alone in exile at Sant'Andrea in Percussina, stripped of his government position, broke, humiliated, having survived imprisonment and torture at the hands of the Medici earlier that same year. A man with every reason in the world to need approval, every reason to keep talking, keep explaining himself, keep begging the powerful to let him back in. Instead, he went quiet. He built. He wrote the most influential political manual in Western history in that silence, not in the palace, not surrounded by allies and advisers, in the ruins of his former life, with nothing but time, discipline, and the dangerous clarity that comes when the noise finally stops. That document is The Prince, and what it teaches about detachment, focus, and the psychology of power is not ancient history. It is the operating manual being used against you right now by people who never told you the rules existed. What you call distractedness. Machiavelli called surrender of territory. What you call being a good person, he called strategic vulnerability. What you call loyalty to everyone around you, he understood as the surest path to conquering nothing. You have been loyal to the noise, patient with the interruptions, generous with your rarest resource, attention, toward people who never once asked whether you could afford to give it. That ends today. Because there is a version of you being built right now in whatever silence you've managed to carve out. And this video exists to protect that version, to give it language, to hand it a framework built 500 years ago by a man who understood power at its coldest and most honest, and who paid in blood, exile, and ruin for having the courage to write it down. The question Machiavelli forces you to ask is brutal in its simplicity. Are you controlling access to yourself, or is everyone else? Listen to what the prince actually says, not the sanitized version, not the motivational quote version, the real one. In chapter 17, Machiavelli writes that it is better to be feared than loved, not because love has no value, but because love, when it becomes dependence, creates a leash. The man who governs by affection alone governs through a chain that others can pull at will. He cannot make unpopular decisions without bleeding approval. He cannot withdraw his energy without generating guilt. He cannot focus without permission. And permission, in Machiavelli's world, is just power with softer language. Most people who consume content about discipline, success, about building something real, they understand the concept. They nod along. Then they go answer the text message. They explain the silence. They rearrange tomorrow's schedule because someone had feelings about yesterday, not because they're weak, because no one ever showed them the mechanism clearly. The mechanism is this: your attention is a principato, a territory, and like every territory in Machiavelli's Italy, it either has a sovereign governing it with intention, or it has whoever got there first. Right now, we are going to break down exactly how that territory gets taken from you, how Machiavelli saw it happening 5 centuries ago, and what the architecture of reclaiming it actually looks like. Not as philosophy, not as motivation, but as cold strategy. The kind that produces results instead of feelings. Let's start where Machiavelli started, with the nature of the thing itself. He was not a romantic about human beings. He did not write about men as he wished them to be. He wrote about them as they were. And in chapter 15 of The Prince, he makes a statement that should reorient every relationship you have. He writes that there is such a distance between how men live and how they ought to live, that a prince who abandons what is done for what ought to be done learns his destruction rather than his preservation. Read that again. The distance between how people live and how they ought to live is the trap. You operate based on how you believe people should behave, with honesty, with consistency, with reciprocity. You extend trust because you believe trust is the baseline. You invest emotional energy because you believe investment eventually returns. You stay available because you believe availability will be valued, not simply consumed. Machiavelli is not telling you that people are evil. He is telling you something more precise and infinitely more useful. He is telling you that when interest and morality conflict, interest wins. Not every time, not with every person, but with enough consistency that a man who builds his strategic world on the assumption that people will choose principle over convenience will be surprised, repeatedly, by the same pattern until he either learns to read it or gets buried by it. This is not cynicism. This is the foundation of clear sight. Cesare Borgia understood it. When Borgia moved into the Romagna, the region of central Italy that would become his power base, he did not arrive with a speech about values. He did not build trust through transparency. He studied the landscape, identified what every relevant player needed and feared, and built alliances around those cold realities. He knew who could be bought, who could be converted, and who could not be neutralized except through removal, and he acted accordingly. By 1502, in an episode Machiavelli witnessed firsthand and documented in chapter 7 of The Prince, Borgia invited a group of condottieri who had conspired against him, Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverotto da Fermo, and the Orsini brothers, to a reconciliation meeting in Sinigaglia. He greeted them warmly. He sat with them. He made them comfortable. Then he had them strangled. Machiavelli watched this, travelled to Borgia's court as a Florentine diplomat, observed the man operate up close, and his conclusion was not horror. It was admiration, specifically for the clarity of Borgia's strategic vision, for the complete absence of sentimentality in his execution, for the understanding that men who have demonstrated they will move against you once will move against you again, and that sentiment in that situation is not virtue. It is vulnerability. Now, before you think this is only about enemies and betrayal, it isn't. This is about something much more common, much quieter, and far more destructive. The condottieri who plotted against Borgia were not strangers. They were former allies, people who had access to his plans, who knew his patterns, who had eaten at his table. And in Machiavelli's Anatomy of Power, that is precisely the profile of the most dangerous kind of threat. Not the declared enemy, not the obvious obstacle, the intimate access point. Think about your own territory. Think about who has access to your daily attention, your mental bandwidth, your time before the day starts and your energy after it ends. Who is consistently in those spaces? And more importantly, what are they doing with the access? Machiavelli writes in the Discourses on Livy that men who live entirely at the mercy of fortune are lost the moment fortune changes because they have built no internal capacity for resistance. They have outsourced the governance of their own principato to circumstance, to other people's moods, to whatever emotional weather system was most recent. This is the state most people are living in, not because of a single dramatic betrayal, because of accumulated small surrenders. The conversation you entered because silence felt rude, the plan you abandoned because someone expressed doubt, the morning routine you skipped because someone needed something from you at midnight, the project you delayed because announcing it would have required defending it. Each of those is territory. Each of those is a square foot of your domain handed to someone else's Fortuna. And the catastrophic part, the part Machiavelli would find most telling, is that the people who extracted that territory from you probably didn't plan to. They didn't plot. They didn't conspire. They simply needed, and you responded, because you were trained to respond, because availability was what you were told was virtuous, because answering was what good people did. The strategy wasn't conscious on their end, but the result was strategic nonetheless. This is what Machiavelli meant when he described the difference between virtù and fortuna. Virtù, and this is critical, because the English word virtue doesn't capture it, is not moral goodness. It is strategic capacity. It is the ability to see clearly, act decisively, and shape events through your own force of will and preparation, rather than being shaped by them. Fortuna is everything outside your control. The external currents, the other people's needs, the market conditions, the timing. The man of virtù uses fortuna. The man without it is used by it. Which one are you right now? Stop for a moment. Think about the last 7 days. How many hours did you spend in conversations that moved nothing forward? How many times did you explain yourself to someone who had no genuine interest in understanding? How much of your clearest thinking time, the quiet morning hours, the late night focus, got borrowed by someone else's emotional need? Write it down if you have to, because when you quantify it, the number is almost always larger than your ego wants to admit. And this is exactly where the Machiavellian framework does something that most productivity content refuses to do. It doesn't pretend there's a comfortable version of this. It doesn't suggest you can reclaim your focus while maintaining every relationship at its current level of access. It doesn't tell you that you can build quietly while staying loudly available. Machiavelli tells you the truth. Chapter 16. A ruler who possesses the qualities of honesty and integrity, but always practices them, will find them harmful. He must know how to use both the nature of the fox and the nature of the lion, because the lion cannot protect itself from snares, and the fox cannot protect itself from wolves. The fox moves without broadcasting its direction. The lion doesn't negotiate with noise. You need both. Now, here is where most people who understand this intellectually still fail. They understand the theory. They see the mechanism. They agree that focus is sacred and availability is expensive. And then they try to maintain every existing dynamic while secretly upgrading their internal standards, and they break under the weight of the contradiction. Because the crowd does not quietly accept your withdrawal. This is the part Machiavelli addresses in his analysis of what happens when a new principality attempts to consolidate. Chapter 3. It is the nature of men to feel obliged by the good you do them as much as by the harm you do them. And when those who expected access lose it, they do not simply adjust, They produce narrative. They say you changed. They say you think you're better than everyone. They say you're being distant, cold, difficult. They reach for the most recent version of you that was useful to them, and they keep attempting to summon that person through pressure, through guilt, through strategic nostalgia. They bring up history. They bring up loyalty. They bring up the time you needed them, conveniently omitting all the times they needed you and you delivered. This is not malicious necessarily. This is Machiavellian in the truest sense, unconscious self-interest operating through available leverage. They are not plotting. They are simply doing what humans do when they feel their access to a resource is threatened. And your job is not to hate them for it. It is to see it clearly enough that you don't capitulate. Because capitulation in this context is not compassion. It is not loyalty. It is not strength. It is the decision to remain within reach of people whose version of you is smaller than who you're becoming, because their comfort felt more urgent than your trajectory. Machiavelli's observation of Borgia included this note, that the men who failed around Borgia were not stupid. They were sentimental at the wrong moments. They let the appearance of reconciliation override the data of demonstrated behavior. They chose the narrative of repair over the information of pattern. The condottieri at Sinigaglia chose comfort over accuracy. It was the last choice they made. Now, you're not dealing with political assassination, but the structural principle is identical. When the information pattern tells you that someone is consuming more of your territory than they are contributing to your capacity, sentimental override of that data is not kindness. It is self-betrayal dressed up as virtue. And Machiavelli would tell you, has been telling you through 500 years of available text, that the man who confuses self-betrayal with virtue will lose everything. Not dramatically, not all at once, in the slow accumulation of small surrenders that look, from the outside, like being a good person. Let's talk about silence, because this is where the framework becomes most practical and most misunderstood. In chapter 16, Machiavelli writes about the necessity of concealment, of not revealing the full shape of your intentions before your strength is ready to defend them. He's not talking about deception for its own sake. He is talking about the vulnerability created by premature transparency. When you announce what you're building before it can defend itself, you invite two things: interference and the weight of other people's doubt. Both are heavy. Both slow you down. Both create a version of accountability that serves everyone except the mission. The discipline of silence is not emptiness. It is resource management at the most fundamental level, keeping the narrative of your development inside the only container where it's safe: your own focus. Think about what happens when you share a goal too early, before you've proven it to yourself, before the reps are there, before the structure has hardened enough to withstand scrutiny. What you get back from the crowd is not support, it is projection. Their fear of their own unused potential reflected at you through the language of concern. Are you sure? That's risky. I tried something like that once. What if it doesn't work? These are not bad people. They are people operating under their own Fortuna, trying to protect their equilibrium by preventing yours from threatening it. Machiavelli knew this. He watched it happen at the highest levels of Florentine and Italian politics. Plans revealed too early became targets. Ambitions stated too openly became threats to those who needed you small. The prince, who governed through transparency, governed through his enemy's intelligence. So, the discipline is this: Let the work become louder than the announcement. Let the result enter the room before the explanation does. Let the silence do what patience always does. It lets you prepare while others assume nothing is happening. This is not arrogance. This is the fox, moving without broadcasting direction, building without needing witnesses, arriving already formed at a destination that others assumed was still hypothetical. In his letter to Francesco Vettori, written December 10th, 1513, Machiavelli describes his days in exile, the hunting in the morning, the reading of ancient poets, the disputes at the tavern in the afternoon. And then at night, he writes, he removes his dirty clothes, puts on royal and courtly garments, and enters the ancient courts of ancient men to speak with them, to ask them for the reason of their actions. He does this for 4 hours without boredom. He forgets every trouble. He does not fear poverty. He is not frightened by death. In 4 hours of focused, silent study, completely alone, he extracted what became the most consulted text on power in the Western canon, 4 hours, alone, in exile. The most powerful work of his life required no audience. It required no approval. It required no external validation that the project was worthwhile. It required only the discipline to show up to the silence and work. That is the model. Not the motivational speech version, the actual version. The man stripped of everything except the capacity to direct his attention, choosing to direct it. If you have been watching this and something has been unlocking, this is the moment where I want to ask you something honest. Who currently holds unauthorized access to your strategic focus? Not enemies, not people who openly oppose you. I'm asking about the ones you trust, the ones who mean well, the ones whose need for your presence you have been treating as your responsibility to fill every day at the cost of the hours that belong to the mission. Write it down in the comments, not their names, just the category. Is it family? Old friendships you've outgrown? A relationship where you perform availability because the silence creates guilt? A social environment that requires you to keep your ambition quiet to preserve the peace? Write one word, just one category, because when you see it in text, something shifts. You are no longer experiencing it as ambient pressure. You are observing it as a pattern, and patterns can be studied. Patterns can be managed. Patterns can, through the discipline that Machiavelli called Virtù, be made to serve your direction instead of consuming it. I read these, all of them, and I want to know which territory is currently ungoverned. Let's address the part that sounds coldest, because Machiavelli never apologized for the cold parts, and neither will this. The people who benefit most from your unlimited availability are not, in general, the people who add the most to your capacity. This is not cynical. This is structural. The people who need you most loudly are often the ones whose development has been subsidized by your attention in ways that prevented their own self-sufficiency. Your constant availability solved problems for them that they never had to solve for themselves. And when you begin to withdraw that availability, when you begin to govern your own territory, the loudest resistance comes from those who benefited most from the previous arrangement. This is what Machiavelli observed in every principality attempting consolidation. Those who gained most under the previous regime fight hardest against the new order, not because the new order is worse for the collective, because it is worse for them specifically, in this specific way, that they can no longer extract at the same rate. He writes in chapter 4 that the kingdom of Darius, conquered by Alexander, did not rebel after Alexander's death because the entire governing infrastructure had been replaced. There was nothing left to organize a resistance through. The old structure had been dismantled. The new one was self-sustaining. You do not need to be Alexander, but you need to understand what he understood. When you rebuild the governance of your own principato, when you establish new rules about access to your time, your attention, your emotional energy, the resistance is not a signal that you're doing something wrong. It is confirmation that the old structure depended on your compliance to function. The discomfort in the room is evidence that the walls are going up, that the territory is beginning to have a sovereign. Let them feel the shift. It is, paradoxically, the most useful thing you can offer them, because as long as you are infinitely available, they have no pressure to develop their own capacity. Your absence creates a vacuum they will eventually be forced to fill with their own resourcefulness, their own initiative, their own virtù. This is not cruelty. This is, in the longest possible view, generosity. But it will not feel that way in the room. And your job is not to manage how it feels in the room. Your job is to govern the territory. There is a concept in The Prince that almost everyone misquotes when they talk about Machiavelli. Chapter 17, the famous passage about whether it is better to be loved or feared. What Machiavelli actually writes is this: one ought to be both feared and loved, but as it is difficult for the two to go together, it is much safer to be feared than loved if one of the two has to be wanting. Safer, not better. Safer. In the specific context of maintaining power when resources are scarce and pressure is high. He's not prescribing hatred. He is not advocating cruelty for its own sake. He is pointing at a specific structural reality, that love, when it becomes attachment, becomes leverage. That the man who governs through affection alone is governed by whoever can threaten to withdraw it. This is the mechanism that operates in your relationships, your professional environment, your social infrastructure. Wherever someone has learned that your response to emotional withdrawal is to increase your generosity, to work harder for their approval, to reduce your standards to preserve the peace. They are not necessarily doing this consciously. They learned what works. They repeat what works. This is not manipulation in the sinister sense. It is conditioning in the straightforward, behavioral sense. And the way out of conditioning is not anger, not explanation, not confrontation. It is the quiet removal of the reward. When withdrawal no longer produces your pursuit, the behavior has no fuel. When your silence can no longer be broken by guilt, the guilt loses its functional value. When your approval is genuinely not available for purchase through emotional performance, the performance gradually stops because it costs and pays nothing. This is what Machiavelli means when he says that fear is safer. Not fear of harm, fear of the absence of your respect, your time, your energy, your engagement. Not cruelty, calibration. The disciplined allocation of your presence toward what earns it and the measured withdrawal of it from what does not. This is the technology of becoming expensive to reach. And the counterintuitive result, the thing that everyone who builds it is always surprised by, is that the people around you who adapt to this reality respect you more, not less. Because human beings, at every level of Machiavelli's analysis, are wired to treat access to rare resources with greater care than access to abundant ones. When you were always available, your time had no scarcity. No scarcity means no value assigned. The moment your time has a gate, it acquires weight. The people who are right for this season of your life will adapt to the gate. They will earn access. They will bring something to the exchange. They will not simply consume. The ones who are only there for the consumption will leave. Both of those outcomes are exactly what you need. Now, let's talk about what the Discourses on Livy adds here. Because the Prince is the famous one, but the Discourses is where Machiavelli actually reveals his longer-term thinking about what sustains power beyond the initial consolidation. He talks about Roman military discipline, about the structure of their training, their hierarchy, their unwillingness to let individual emotional states override collective strategic function. The Roman soldier did not stop training because he felt unmotivated. He did not renegotiate his assignment based on current mood. The structure was the structure, and the structure was sovereign over the individual's impulse. This is the model for what you need to build internally. Your daily structure is your military discipline. Your habits are your legion. And the mission they serve, the thing you are actually building, the identity you are actually becoming, is the commander. Not motivation, not inspiration, command. Machiavelli observed that Rome's greatest strength was not genius, it was repeatability. The ability of their systems to function when conditions were difficult, when morale was low, when the outcome was uncertain. The system ran because the system was designed to run regardless of how the individual soldier felt about running it on that particular morning. Your routine must become that system. Not because discipline is romantic, it isn't. Not because consistency is exciting, it generally isn't. But because the gap between who you are right now and who you need to become is not a gap of talent. It is a gap of governed repetition. The crowd around you is ungoverned repetition. Same conversations, same loops, same comfortable patterns that produce the same outcomes year after year, while everyone inside the loop convinces each other that something is about to change. You know this. That's why you're here. The question is not whether you understand what Machiavelli understood. The question is whether you're willing to build the discipline that makes the understanding operational. Because understanding without structure is just better informed stagnation. The Prince without the daily command is just interesting reading. Here is where the framework becomes a practice rather than a philosophy, and where I want to be specific with you about what the architecture actually looks like. The first structural layer is access governance. Machiavelli writes in chapter 99 that a prince must consider how to avoid those things which will make him hated or contemptible. Chief among those things is being perceived as unstable, as a resource that can be moved by pressure, guilt, or emotional display. The prince who reacts to every provocation signals that provocation is effective. The one who observes without reaction signals that provocation has no yield. Access governance means who can reach you, at what time, through which channels, and for what categories of need. This is not cruelty. This is administration. Kingdoms without administration collapse under the weight of every subject's individual request. Minds without access, governance collapse under the weight of every contact's individual need. Build the gate, not with anger, not with announcement, simply with the behavioral reality of your response patterns. Respond slower. Respond to fewer things. Let the silence teach the lesson that words would only invite argument about. The second structural layer is concealment of development. As we discussed, the Machiavellian doctrine of revealing intention only when strength can defend it. This means removing the habit of sharing process publicly, sharing aspirations socially, Announcing plans before they have momentum. It means building in silence, working without the validation loop, training without the documentation impulse, developing without the audience. This is harder than it sounds in a period where the infrastructure of every platform rewards real-time transparency and punishes invisibility. But Machiavelli was explicit. Immature men seek recognition for effort rather than results. They want sympathy for struggle before the struggle has produced anything worth witnessing. Patience is not passive. It is the active decision to let the work accumulate past the threshold of dismissibility before you allow it to be seen. The third layer, and this is the one people underestimate most, is the internal governance of emotional reaction. In chapter 16, Machiavelli's description of the fox and the lion is not about external strategy alone. It is about what you do with what you feel in the face of pressure. The lion's impulse is to charge every provocation. The fox's discipline is to assess before acting. The prince who cannot access the fox when the situation requires it will win every confrontation emotionally and lose everything strategically. You may feel the anger, you may feel the pull toward justification, toward defense, toward making the record clear. Machiavelli does not ask you to eliminate those feelings. He asks you to govern them, to treat them as information to be processed, not commands to be obeyed. The emotion tells you what is happening. Strategy tells you what to do with it. This is the interior principato, the one that every external result depends on, and it is the one where most people's focus is most ungoverned. Let's be precise about what this detachment is not, because Machiavelli is not advocating isolation as an end. He is not describing a life of hermetic withdrawal and cold indifference to human connection. He is describing the conditions under which a man of genuine capacity can develop and deploy that capacity without it being dismantled by ambient pressure. In his letter to Vettori, he describes the evening hours at San Casciano with genuine joy, the intellectual communion with the ancient men whose books lined his shelves, the return to thought after the noise of the afternoon. He was not trying to become an island. He was trying to become an island during the hours that required depth. He understood the difference between social noise and genuine exchange. He had both in appropriate measure, in their appropriate time. The goal is not to become unreachable to everyone. The goal is to become ungovernable by anyone. There is a fundamental difference. The man who is ungovernable is not cold. He is clear. He knows what deserves access and what does not. He is present with full intensity to what has earned that presence. He is genuinely unreachable to what has not. That sharpness of distinction, that precision of allocation, is what Machiavelli admired in Borgia and what he tried to distill into portable principle. Not the ruthlessness for its own sake, the clarity that ruthlessness sometimes serves. When you build this, the people who deserve a place in your principato will find it more valuable, not less. Because the attention they receive is no longer diluted by 1,000 other competing claims. Because the time they access is no longer borrowed from 1,000 other obligations. Because the version of you they encounter has been governed, focused, directed, you will be less available and infinitely more present. At some point in The Prince, chapter 5, Machiavelli turns to the question of fortune directly. He describes her as a woman and says she favors the bold, the impetuous, the one who acts with force rather than with cautious hesitation. This is the most quoted passage in the book, and almost always It is quoted incompletely. What people leave out is his preceding analysis. He writes that fortune governs one half of our actions and leaves the other half to us. The point is not that boldness alone conquers all. The point is that preparation, structure, and accumulated virtue position you to take advantage of fortune when she presents the occasion, the window of strategic opportunity. The man who has scattered his attention, drained his energy into the maintenance of 100 small access points, and postponed the development of his actual capacity, is not positioned to take the occasione when it appears. He is still assembling the resources that should have been built in the quiet season. The occasione does not announce itself in advance, it appears, and it rewards only the one who is already prepared to meet it. Machiavelli saw this repeatedly in Italian politics. Principalities that fell not because they were weak in absolute terms, but because they were unprepared relative to the moment. Their princes had spent the quiet years available to everyone when they should have been building the infrastructure that would make them formidable when the moment required formidability. This is the cost of remaining fully available to the noise, not some abstract future cost, the specific, concrete cost of not being ready when the window opens, and windows close. If you have made it here, you have consumed something today that is not comfortable, that is not designed to send you back into your day feeling validated and warm. It is designed to make you see the structure of what is actually happening around you with enough precision that you can make a different decision about what to do next. This is what this channel exists for, not to tell you what you want to hear, to give you the language and the framework that Machiavelli spent a lifetime, an exiled, impoverished, historically overlooked lifetime, synthesizing from the rawest observation of human nature and power that the Renaissance produced. Each video here is a different angle on the same core territory. The anatomy of how power is taken, how it is kept, how it is lost, and what separates the man who understands those mechanics from the one who keeps being surprised by them. If you want to keep building this map, if you want to understand not just the theory, but the specific strategic applications in the environments you're actually navigating, subscribe. Not because it helps the numbers, because this is the sequence, and sequences only work when you stay in them. The man who dips in takes one concept and goes back to the noise gets one tool. The man who stays, who builds the full architecture, who understands the relationships between Virtù and Fortuna, between concealment and timing, between the fox and the lion, and the specific situations each one demands. That man becomes difficult to maneuver. That is the goal. Let's close where Machiavelli himself always returned in his darkest analysis, to the nature of what is actually being built when a man governs himself. He was not building a philosophy for rulers in the conventional sense. He was writing a manual for anyone who understood that the territory they were responsible for was first and foremost the territory between their ears and inside their chest. That external conquest without internal governance produces what he called the principato, acquired by fortune and another's arms, impressive-looking, fundamentally unstable, dependent for its survival on conditions the prince did not create and cannot sustain. He watched those principalities fall. He documented why. He wrote the antidote. The antidote is the man who cannot be destabilized by withdrawal because he is not dependent, who cannot be bought with approval because he does not crave it, who cannot be seduced from the mission by comfort because comfort has become less interesting than progress, who cannot be manipulated by guilt because his obligations to himself are explicit, documented, and sovereign. Not a cold man, a governed man, not an isolated man, a selective man. Not a man without emotion, a man whose emotions serve the mission rather than commanding it. This is what Machiavelli was building toward in that farmhouse at Sant'Andrea in Percussina in the winter of 1513. Broke, exiled, stripped of everything that society said should define him, and choosing, in that emptiness, to do the most sovereign thing available to him. He directed his attention. He built something that would outlast every prince he ever observed. He wrote The Prince, and 500 years later, we are still reading it, still learning from it, still finding in it the architecture of a life that cannot be taken from you by someone's mood, their disappointment, their withdrawal, or their inability to see what you're becoming before it's finished. That is what detachment produces in its highest form. Not the absence of connection, the presence of something so internally solid that connection becomes a choice rather than a survival strategy. You stop needing the crowd to feel real, and the moment you stop needing it, you become the most interesting person in any room you choose to enter. Because there is nothing more compelling, more unsettling, more magnetic than a person who genuinely could take or leave your approval. That is the fox and the lion in the same body. That is Machiavellian power at its most complete. The question now is not whether you understood it. The question is what you do with the next hour, because that hour belongs to you, and you are the only sovereign it has ever had. Detach, build, stay silent, let them wonder, let the work speak, and when it does, don't explain the journey. Let the empire speak for you. Comment below the single word that describes the territory you've been surrendering. Just one word, because naming it is the first act of governance. And somewhere in these comments, someone is going to read your word and finally recognize the name of what's been consuming their focus too. That is the power of this community, not mutual comfort, mutual clarity. I am no longer available to weakness. Write it, mean it, lock it. The old version of you served his purpose. He is no longer needed here.